In a world where Harry Potter never triumphed, where the last stand at Hogwarts became a massacre rather than a victory, Fair's walls, the Ministry felt its walls no longer sheltering justice, but the Order of the Phoenix was hunted down, its members scattered or slain. And in this darkness there were those who did not wield wands in battle, who did not choose a side in the war but still found themselves swallowed by. Among them was Elias Travers, a quiet man who had never sought power, never dared to dream beyond the safety of anonymity. He had worked in the Department of Magical Transportation, once nothing more than a clerk handling, but the fall of the Ministry had rewritten his life in blood and ink. The office where he worked now had a new function, an unspoken one but understood by every man who sat hunched over parchment beneath the watchful gaze of Death Eater. They were record keepers of fate, scribes of life and death. Their task, to process lists of suspected blood traitors, dissidents, and enemies of the Dark Lord's reign. Names arrived on long rolls of parchment enchanted to be cross-checked. Those whose names remained on the lists were marked for capture. Most never returned. It was quiet work, muns that were nothing more than words, memes that were nothing. A name that sent a ripple through his chest. Not just a name, a person. A face, a boy from his past, from another life, a friend. They had been schoolmates once, though not. Elias had been the cautious one, the boy who never stepped out of line, who avoided taking sides in the growing tensions of the wizarding world. Adrian, on the other hand, he had spoken against Voldemort's rise, when it was still just whispers in the halls of Hogwarts, had openly voiced disgust at the ideology of blood purity. It's madness, they had once said back in their 6th year. People like us, people who stay silent, 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 stay silent. Elias hadn't argued. He never argued. He had only listened and kept his head down. Now, years later, Adrian once more, and silence was no longer an option. The only sounds were the faint scratch of quills, the slow, rhythmic breaths of men pretending not to think too hard about what they were doing. He could remove Adrian's name, a single flick of his wand, a spell so subtle, so undetectable, it would seem Nemazith the name and 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 never been there. Imazith 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 the name and never been there at all. The list would move forward. Adrian would have a chance. But Elias knew the risk. These lists were enchanted. Each name was monitored. The enchanted quill that hovered over the parchment pulsed with magic, recording every move. If a name disappeared without the proper authorization, it would be noticed. It always was. A man had tested it before. Samuel Goyle, another clerk, another man who had sat in the very same... A man who had hesitated just a moment too long on a name, just long enough for the quill's magic to take note. The next moment the door had burst open and two hooded figures had stepped inside. They hadn't asked questions. They had simply cast the killing curse, and Samuel Goyle had crumpled to the floor, dead before his mouth could even form a protest. His body had been dragged away, his desk wiped clean. By the next day, someone else had taken his place. Elias's hands were clammy, his pulse hammered. He glanced toward the door, half expecting it to burst open at any second, to hear that cold, merciless voice command him to stand, to feel the searing green light of death before he could even decide. Adrian Wilkes' name remained in front of him, a single movement, a single choice. He imagined Adrian's face, the way he had laughed once years ago, the way he had spoken of resistance with fire in his voice, the way he would look if he realized that someone he once called a friend had sealed his fate with a stroke of a quill. Elias swallowed hard. Across the room, another quill moved steadily, another clerk submitting another name to the inevitable. His wand hand twitched. The ink glistened under the candlelight, final and unmoving. Elias sat motionless for the rest of the day, his hands numb, his mind empty. When the parchments were gathered at the end of the shift, he didn't look up. He didn't need to. He already knew Adrian Wilkes would not be seen again. He sat in his small, lifeless flat, staring at the single candle flickering on his table, watching the wax melt down in slow, inevitable ruin. He told himself he had no choice, that it had been beyond his control, that this was survival. But survival had never felt so much like dying. And in the silence of that long, empty night, he realized that he had made his choice long before he ever lifted his quill.